What's up, y'all? It's Dr. Paul with a follow-up video to my recent mail call and mail fail videos for Liberty Hill Comics. If you're new to the channel, welcome. This is where I share my passion and experience in comic book collecting, investing, and conservation with you. A few months back in a mail call video, I unboxed this copy of Showcase number 22, the Mega Key, first appearance of Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern from the very early Silver Age of comic books, published in 1959, so nearly 65 years old now. I was thrilled to acquire a beautiful, apparently mid-grade copy of this blue-chip collectible, but once I was off camera, I did a more thorough check, as I always do, and I discovered that this book had been restored. In a follow-up video, I shared my process for doing a thorough check for restoration and what to do if you purchase a book over the internet and discover it's been restored. I published that video with the situation unresolved and promised to update you once it was settled. Well, it took a while, but there was finally a conclusion to this unfortunate turn of events, and in today's video, I'm going to reveal the final outcome, my advice on how to avoid situations like this, and what to do if a seller is regrettably not being as honest and forthright as they ought to be. If you want to check out the unboxing video or the follow-up video on the evidence I found for restoration and the steps I took to resolve this issue peacefully, just follow this link to the playlist I've created for this series of videos. Before we jump into the resolution, let's discuss why comic book restoration matters. After all, aren't comics just funny books, and why should it matter if a comic book has some ink on the cover that wasn't there originally, or a bit of the paper trimmed off? Well, in CGC 5.0, Showcase number 22 has a fair market value today of $6,000 due to its rarity and desirability in the collector market. And in restored condition, the value is a fraction of that, usually in the ballpark of a quarter to one-third of the non-restored value. In this specific case, there was a recent sale in CGC 5.0 restored, so we know exactly the fair market value is just a bit under $2,000. That is less than one-third of the non-restored value. So, selling a restored comic book as if it's an original, unmolested comic book is potentially fraud. In this particular case, the seller, whether purposefully or not, is cheating the buyer, that's me, of over $4,000 of value. If it's intentional, it's fraud and can have civil and criminal consequences. Now, I always afford the seller the benefit of the doubt in these situations until they prove they don't deserve it, as this seller did. That's when the gloves come off. Before we get into the specifics of this comic book, a discussion of the definition of restoration of comic books generally is probably in order. Restoration includes any additive or subtractive process performed on a comic book with the intent to restore the comic book to original appearance. Restoration is performed primarily for aesthetic and financial reasons, to make the comic book look better by essentially hiding flaws. Comic book restoration is generally frowned upon just as it is for other high-end antiquities and collectibles, and restored books are generally significantly less desirable by collectors and investors. Because there is less demand, the value goes down, so restored books are sold at a significant discount to a non-restored book of the same grade. In fact, there is generally so little demand for restored books that CGC uses a purple label for restored comics, and there is an acronym for the restored label, PLOD, which stands for Purple Label of Death. Prices fetched for restored comics are generally less than half of a non-restored copy, in the range of 25 to 35%, depending on the book. After thorough examination, I determined this comic book had restoration that had not been disclosed by the seller. CGC defines 11 different sorts of restoration: color touch, piece fill, tear seals, spine split seals, reinforcement, piece reattachment, cleaning, staple replacement, reglossing, glue, and trimming. After thorough examination, I determined this comic book was 100% certain to have been color touched, and I was also about 95% certain it had been trimmed. For the evidence of the restoration, including pictures, explanation, and rationale, see the detailed video on the subject, which I'll provide a link to here. Taken together, the evidence pointed to this book being restored at some point in the past, and not by a kid, but by an experienced restorer. The color touch is a pretty good match, and even has the correct sheen to blend in with the cover. It's only noticeable under magnification or UV light. This tells me that someone restored it with the intention of improving the value. Someone for whom this was not the first comic book they worked on. This can be fine if it's disclosed, but the problem is somewhere along the way, unfortunately, whether by deceit or by accident, a buyer purchased this comic book without the restoration disclosed. This can be for many reasons. It could be that someone passed away and their heirs are selling the collection and they're not comic book experts and had no way of knowing the book was restored. Or it could be that someone deceived a relatively naive buyer who at some point in the future became a seller. Or it could be that the seller is aware of the restoration, but is just deceitful and is trying to maximize profit by attempting to sell it to a sucker. Unfortunately, it seems this may have been the case with the book I purchased, based on the seller's less than stellar response to my polite notification to them that the book had been restored. I always start by giving the seller the benefit of the doubt. In this case, I did exactly that. I messaged the seller politely and apologetically, but firmly explained that I'm sure they're honest and perhaps they were deceived by a previous seller, but unfortunately, I'm returning the item. This particular seller, Hazers1, chose not to respond to my messages but to ignore them. I waited 4 days for a response and then I started a return process with eBay. I took good pictures and provided my evidence that the book is restored and waited for a response from eBay. Unfortunately, the seller denied my request for a return and eBay would not intervene on my behalf. That is because although I opened the book and messaged the seller just inside the 30-day window, when I requested the return 4 days later, I was just outside the 30-day window, during which eBay provides essentially full return privileges to the buyer of an item, even if the seller lists it as is, or no returns. This is entirely my fault, but the reasons I was outside the window is that I like to do the unboxing videos for the channel, and had gotten a little behind with getting videos out while balancing life and content creation for Liberty Hill Comics. And I gave the seller a polite message and waited for their response before initiating a return. I've since changed how I generate my videos, and I open boxes promptly on camera and write a script and record a voiceover to the video later. Well, I'm sure the seller thought they had pulled one over on me, and my options at this point were nil. But, as I said, selling a restored item and not disclosing it is potentially fraud if it is done intentionally. If you find yourself outside eBay's 30-day window as I did, you still have options available to protect yourself from this. I had paid for this copy of Showcase number 22 with a credit card, and I called my credit card company up, which is Chase Visa by the way, and explained the situation to them. They placed the charge in dispute, which meant I didn't have to pay for it until the situation was resolved, and they sent the seller a notification that I had indicated the item was restored and requested a return. Unfortunately, the seller denied the return again, thinking that I had no recourse and that they had got one over on me. So, Chase asked me if I could provide evidence from a qualified third-party expert that the item was restored. I said of course I could, because I know many people in the comic book industry that despise dishonest sellers and scammers and would relish the opportunity to bring one of them to justice. So I reached out to a friend in the industry, Bill Williams, who has been a comic book retailer for over 30 years and is currently subject matter expert for comic books at Collector Crossroads in Austin, Texas. By the way, he is also a comic book writer, inker, and letterer, and has a host of credits to his name, including a bunch of independent comics and some work for DC. His current project is a creator-owned comic book named Punchline, years before the Punchline from DC, by the way, that is being published by Antarctic Press and is a coming-of-age story about a young superheroine granted powers of a supernatural nature. I don't read very many modern comic books, but I highly recommend you check it out. I think it would make a great project for the small screen, and someone should definitely option it. After showing Bill the book and explaining the situation to him, he agreed it was obviously restored and was even more certain than I was about the trimming, and he agreed to help. He drafted a letter explaining his bona fides and detailing the evidence of restoration with plenty of clear pictures. I sent his signed letter to Chase Bank, and they took it from there. They presented this evidence to the seller's bank and demanded a refund for the transaction. The seller's bank knew at this point their customer, the seller, had sold a restored book and had misrepresented it, and they did not want to be liable for potential fraud. So they yanked the money from his account and provided it to Chase Visa, who then notified me that they had resolved the case in my favor and that the full disputed amount would be credited to my account. And I'm under no obligation to return the restored book to the seller. No request was made to do so by Chase Visa, eBay, the seller, or his bank. If you buy and sell comic books through the internet, sooner or later you will have a transaction that goes sideways. This is inevitable, and it's a bummer that can really feel like a gut punch and make you not even want to look at comic books for a while because it's a huge feel bad. This is natural. It's part of the human response of experiencing loss. Even though it's just a funny book, we are passionate about our hobbies, and we do experience being scammed as a loss. You can't control whether or not someone misrepresents a comic book on the internet, but you can control how you respond to that situation. And it's how you respond to these situations that ultimately will determine the resolution of the matter, not only financially, but emotionally as well. In this case, by taking a polite but firm and methodical approach, I was able to recover the money I spent on this misrepresented comic book and keep the comic book as well. At other times, despite my best efforts, I have been scammed by unscrupulous sellers, so you can't win them all. But I have won most of them by following this process. Here are my tips for avoiding costly missteps when buying collectibles on the internet. First, know the rules inside and out. As long as you request a refund within the 30-day window, eBay favors the buyer. Don't abuse this fact, but with evidence that the item is not as described, that is the box you check with your eBay return request, you can get a return mediated by eBay even if the seller listed the item as is, or no returns. Second, even when life gets in the way of you putting in a request within the 30 days, you have options. There will be more work and effort, and there is a bit more risk, but all is not lost. If your evidence is indisputable and your rationale is sound, the banks don't want to be accomplices to a potential fraud case, and, being risk-averse, they will side with you. Lastly, as a seller, don't be a jerk. If a buyer reaches out and states that something is amiss, don't be a bully because you think you have all of the power and they have no recourse once the 30-day window has passed. Hazers 1 made some bad decisions in this transaction. If this seller had just responded to me, they had options to recover some of their equity here. They could have accepted a return and disclosed the restoration to the next buyer and taken a bit less for the book but still recovered some equity. Even restored, this book is worth close to $2,000. they could have offered me a partial refund. If they had offered me anything in the ballpark of, say, $750 partial refund, I may have taken it just to save us both the hassle of a return. But instead, they made a huge mistake. They got greedy, thinking that they could take advantage of me and that my options were limited. Well, that decision cost them the entirety of their equity in this book and possibly problems with their bank. Don't be like Hazers 1. Be a responsible member of the collectibles community. I hope you enjoyed this video on how I reacted to this unscrupulous eBay seller that misrepresented this restored comic book, and how you can protect yourself from bad actors in the collectibles community. It was a long and bumpy ride, but the forces of good prevailed this time. I have to give a shout out to Chase Visa, who stood by their card holder in this instance, and also a huge thank you to Bill Williams, who graciously took time out of his schedule to help me recover from what could have been a costly misstep. Have you ever been scammed before? How did it get resolved? What do you think I should do with this comic book now? Keep it as is? Try to remove the color touch? Get it graded? Sell it? Let me know in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Until next time, happy hunting and take care of one another.